everybody, welcome to Lincoln Douglas Video Essentials. Video number 4. This one's going to be about the contention level, and this is actually going to sum up much of the really basic but core material of the Lincoln Douglas videos. There's going to be a lot more advanced videos that are going to follow, especially on negating, on making turns, on rebuttals, and on a lot of higher level and advanced stuff. But this basically is going to conclude the core basic curriculum, the very basic minimal curriculum of this series, and this is in no way the conclusion of this series, but it's just a checkpoint. So congratulations on getting this far, and let's get into this video. The contention. What is a contention? Now, I've been very tempted to say the word contention in the previous words that I've been, in the previous videos that I've been doing, but instead, I've chosen to refrain from doing that and say the word argument. Well, firstly, because I waited to get to this video, but essentially, what is a contention? A contention is an argument. It's just a fancy way that debaters call arguments in their speeches, in their constructive speeches, and in all of their later speeches, they address all of their major arguments as contentions. Many people phrase it in different ways. They say, firstly, I contend that. Or a lot of people just go off and straight say, contention 1, and then they read some evidence. And a contention contains your arguments within it. Now, these arguments can be empirical, meaning using statistics. They can be analytical, meaning using logic. And they can be any kind of argument, but all these contentions fit in within the case very neatly. There's 3 major parts to a contention, and you're going to remember them and use them using the mnemonic CWI. Just call it CWI. That's what I do. Oh, that's what I did when I was learning the parts of a contention. Before we get into the individual component parts, what role does a contention play in the round? So you probably remember this diagram. This is the framework. And under the framework, you've got your value criterion, your value criterion justifications, your definitions, and your observations. You guys already know that. And if you watch the last video, you'll know all about taking the value criterion and making a framework out of it, and how your arguments have to support your value criterion. That's where contentions come in. The second level of the debate is the contentions. And the contentions, this is where you make your arguments. This is where all of your evidence comes in. This is where stuff that actually pertains to the resolution comes in. So, if it's a resolution involving healthcare. Now, your framework shouldn't really say anything about healthcare. Your framework is just going to be something like utilitarianism, minimizing suffering, and you're going to have a lot of justifications for your framework based on philosophy written by a lot of authors, by people like Nagel and Singer, if you're going to be running a utilitarian framework. And what's important to note about this is, by the very nature of what you're going to be saying in your framework, it's not actually going to pertain to the resolution. Let me give you an example. If our resolution is the United States ought to guarantee to its citizens universal health care, and you want to make the case that you're the affirmative, and by guaranteeing universal health care, you're going to be doing a lot of benefits. So you're going to be maximizing benefits or minimizing suffering for a great number of people, as that's something that universal healthcare seeks to do, is to minimize a lot of suffering in some low-income families and in people who can't even afford healthcare. So you would take as the affirmative, you would say my value is morality, my value criterion is minimizing suffering, justifications for the value criterion, pain is bad, all people would rationally want to be away from pain, so we would also want no person to experience pain, so we would try and remove all of the pain from society. It's not a great justification, but we'll just roll with it. Definitions, you define certain words in the resolutions. This will come in framework. But notice how nothing I've said in my framework is actually about healthcare. It's not about the resolution. It's about how I'm going to be making my arguments. And I've explained that clearly in my framework. But now I gotta have some way of tying in. Okay, how does your framework have to do with resolution? That's where the contentions come in. In your contentions, you say, okay, my goal is to minimize suffering for everybody. So, contention 1, universal healthcare. Universal healthcare provides healthcare for low-income families and those who cannot afford healthcare. And that minimizes suffering. Now, that wouldn't go in your contention 1 headline. You would say contention 1, universal healthcare has successfully been implemented, and you could even make the case that it helps society because it lessens the rich and poor gap. It improves society. It helps the economy. It boosts the Dow Jones Industrial Average. There's several different contentions that you can state, and you have to back them up with evidence. So that's where CWI comes in, because each of your contentions has to be built up, has to be supported. The C is for claim. Now, what a claim is a claim is a statement that you make about your contention. So, claim: implementing universal healthcare will lessen the rich-poor gap in the United States. That's the claim, right? So, and your opponent can just be like, okay, great, but why should I believe you? What do I get from that? And that's where the warrant comes in. See, you can't just say things in a Lincoln Douglas debate round. If you could just say things, then you could just make up a case on the spot. That's where the warrant comes in. The warrant comes in saying, okay, why is this true? So you could say, claim: the implementation of universal healthcare will lessen the rich-poor gap. Warrant: in Canada, after the establishment of, you have to find a study or something that says, in Canada, after the establishment of universal healthcare, the poverty line, increased, and there was less poverty in Canada. And the rich, maybe there was some decrease in total income for the rich, and the rich-poor gap decreased. But whatever it is, it has to be warranted. It has to be warranted using some real evidence. Now, this warrant doesn't have to be with statistics, but it can be with analytics as well. You could say, okay, logically, if we implement universal healthcare, more people would be able to afford healthcare. They'd be able to use their money to do different things. It's been a long time since I've debated this, so I don't remember a lot of the arguments for it. But basically, you get what I'm saying. Now, the final impact. If you could just got up and gave your claim in a warrant, they'd be like, okay, so how does that really help you in the round? That's where the impact comes in. The I, impact. So what you gotta do is you say your claim, you say your warrant, and then you give the impact. What will lessening the rich-poor gap do? Well, lessening the rich-poor gap will improve the lives of so many different people, and that will allow us to minimize suffering. So the impact is where you tie it back into the framework, and you say, okay, how is this going to minimize suffering, or how is this going to do what my framework says that I'm supposed to be doing? If you do, a social contract framework, and you say abiding by the social contract is my framework, okay, how does my contention say that I am abiding by the social contract? Or how does it say that my opponent is not abiding by the social contract? So your contentions are all meant to support some part of your framework. They're meant to establish your framework as something that is resolutional, something that applies to the resolution. So that's the claim, the warrant, and the impact. And every argument that you make in a round has to have these three components, otherwise it's not going to make any sense. I have unfairly lost rounds in which my opponent has not had a warranted contention, and they've still won. Those contentions have been really important to their case, but they actually haven't supported it. But make sure that you warrant all of your arguments, because a warrant is the major component of an argument. So that's the contention level and how it supports your framework. Now, I you can even do is if you've got a big contention, you can divide it up into sub-points so that, you know, it's a little easier to explain. And what helps judges a lot if there's a chain of events that happens so that they can clearly see that you've laid out your steps. But that's only if it's a big contention. So we're looking at app versus neg. Now, I covered this in the last video. If you have a framework of utilitarianism and your opponent has a framework of utilitarianism, this whole part of the round, say for maybe the definition and the observation, these parts are the same. So essentially, you guys are both arguing for utilitarianism. So I could just take this whole area out and write, okay, our framework, they're both the same. So let's agree that we're both going to use that same framework. We'll use util. Now that's your framework for the round. Util is the framework for the round because you both have the same framework. That much cannot be disputed. Now, here's what happens is when you take your contentions, you take your supporting arguments for util over here, and you try and beat your opponent. You try and say, okay, my arguments are better than yours for A, B, C, D, E, many different reasons. And your opponent is going to try and do the exact same thing to you. Now, how you do this is going to be covered in our later videos on weighing and on rebutting. But I'm just trying to explain something to you. So, in the end, whoever has the most contention or the most arguments supporting their case is going to be the winner. And that's the way that it's going to work under a utilitarian framework. So, now that much is clear. Let's take a little step back and let's go back to the framework stage. So we've got, you know, our aff and our neg, we've got our value criterion, justifications, definition, observations, and we're back here. So you guys have different frameworks. You have util, opponent has deon. Now this is where you gotta debate each other's framework. You gotta try and prove your framework of the other person and prove their framework of yours. I brushed over this in the last video, but say that you think that their framework is better than yours, you can say, okay, I'll kick my framework. I'll kick it, and I'll use yours. That's the framework for the round. Now this framework has become the framework, and now what you've got to do is you've got to try and make your contentions tie into their framework. And that's kind of hard to do because if you've got a utilitarian framework and they've got a deontology framework, and you decide to use deontology, your contentions are going to have to be able to be supported as part of the neg framework, which is a hard thing to do. They're going to have to try, you're going to have to show, okay, he's already got contentions, but what my case can do, my contentions alone, can support his framework better than they can support, than his contentions can support his framework. You can win that way too. An easier way to think about it like this. It's no longer his framework anymore if you concede it. It's no longer his framework, it's just the whole round's framework. So it doesn't really belong to him anymore. If the judge chooses his framework, it's not really his framework anymore if you can make a better case through his framework. So there's two parts to the debate. Just because you win framework doesn't mean you're going to win contentions. And just because you win contentions doesn't mean you're going to win framework. So it's by no means can you win by proxy. So that is a quick overview of what's going on with the framework. Really, the framework is not something that pertains to any one debater. It's something that you have to try and make expand in the round. And really, where this all comes in is you got to appeal to the judge. You have to show the judge why the judge should pick this framework A, the app framework, or the neg framework. Once the judge picks one in his head, he's not going to tell you out loud. That's not how the round works. But on the ballot, the judge will say, okay, I'm evaluating the round by the neg framework, or I'm evaluating the round by the app framework. And if the judge has already decided that in his head, if neither of you concedes each other's framework in the round, if neither of you decides, and the judge decides that, okay, the app has appealed to me more with his framework, or the neg has appealed to me more with his framework, then the contentions are going to need to tie into the framework in order to present the best case. And ultimately, the winner will be decided by, once the judge has decided which framework he's going to evaluate the round by, he's going to look at, okay, whose contentions parts of the